Welcome.
I'm Cameron Scott, one of the story architects of Star Wars The High Republic.
This is Dominic Pace, who plays Jakku the Bounty Hunter from The Mandalorian.
Hi, I'm Claudia Gray. I write Star Wars books.
And you're listening.
And you are listening
to Star Wars Comics in Canon. The Force is strong with this one.
Hello there and welcome to Star Wars Comics in Canon, your guide to the wider Star Wars canon through the comic book lens. And to take you on this journey, I'm your host, Mike Burton. And so brings episode 101. So my friends, we've made it past episode 100. If you haven't listened to that episode, please go and check that out. You can listen to it on the feed of Genuine Chit-Chat or on the feed of Comics in Motion, or you can watch the whole thing on YouTube. It's nearly 3 hours long, and myself and Ben answer 20 Star Wars questions from some of you lovely listeners. So you don't need to have consumed any additional Star Wars content or anything like that. I'd probably say watch the movies and probably the Kenobi series, but aside from that, really anyone can listen to that episode, and the Kenobi question doesn't really come right to the very end, and we do give some spoiler warnings for that. But this is not about the Q&A episode, but I'll put a detail to that in the description. This is about the finale of the Poe Dameron comics. So if you haven't joined us before, I'm going to go through the plot details of the comics, and I'm also along the way going to tell you some of the trivia and other bits of information that I find are exciting, such as reoccurring characters, species, planets, those sorts of things to show where it fits into the canon while expanding your canon knowledge. So before I delve into the plot details, I'm going to talk about the personnel and a bit of information about this comic. And if you either wanted a refresher or you haven't listened to the prior episodes of Star Wars Comics in Canon, make sure you check out episodes 85, 89, 91 and 95 for the other 4 volumes of the Poe Dameron comics. You get a bit more of an understanding of the story, and there's certain characters that I give bio information on for those volumes that I won't be repeating in this. So make sure you check those out. So Volume 5 of the Poe Dameron comics includes issues 26 to 31, as well as the Poe Dameron Annual number 2. Issue 26 was released in April 2018, issue 31 was released in September of 2018, the annual number 2 was released in August 2018, and the trade paperback collection was released in December 2018. These comics kind of span times just before The Force Awakens and also after The Last Jedi, so those are the 2 main focal points of these comics. So obviously that's part of the sequel trilogy era, which is where Poe Dameron resides. Now this collection is also called The Spark and the Fire. So the standard issues 26 to 31 were written by Charles Soule. The artist for these issues is Angel Unzueta. The colour artist is Arif Prianto, and Rachelle Rosenberg helps Arif on issue number 27. Annual number 2 was written by Jody Houser. The artist for Annual 2 was Andrea Broccardo, and the colour artist was Stefani Renee. So with all of that in mind, let's get into the plot of these comics, and let's begin with the crawl. So, the Resistance has barely escaped total destruction at the hands of the evil First Order during the Battle of Crate. Their survival depended on sacrifices made by many brave heroes, Jedi Master Luke Skywalker among them. Now, the remnants of General Leia Organa's resistance flee through hyperspace aboard the Millennium Falcon, seeking refuge. In this rare moment of peace, Poe Dameron takes the opportunity to reflect upon the journey that brought him and the rest of the resistance to this point. So the following 6 comics are somewhat of a mishmash, I'd say. There is like a vague plot going through it, but it's kind of the first 3 issues are like the individual issues, kind of. I don't want to downplay how well Charles Soule writes these or anyone involved, but they're basically just like minor plot hole fillers. They almost feel like deleted scenes from The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, and they've just kind of gone, let's just make a comic to answer these, which is definitely a trope. In fact, when I first launched Star Wars Comics in Canon, it actually came from a big podcast collaboration thing I did with Chris and Dave of Comics in Motion and of Scott of the 20th Century Geek. There were instances where I kind of filled in plot holes due to a comic, so that's kind of been the running joke for Comics in Motion quite a while, that there's always a comic that answers a plot hole, and funnily enough, the first 2 or 3 of these comics definitely do that. So I want to preface that just to say the pacing of it may sound a bit peculiar, and obviously I will always suggest to yourselves to pick up the comics yourselves, read through them, because I just give the vague plot details. But for anyone who doesn't have all of the time to do that, or anyone who has already read these comics and wants some bonus content and additional knowledge, then here we go. It is worth noting there are some minor continuity errors in this. It doesn't conflict with the movies or most of the content most people have read, but in the novelization of The Force Awakens there is additional information on what happens, including how Poe escaped the TIE fighter crash and things like that. So in The Force Awakens and in this, in broad strokes they're the same, but there's a couple of minor details that are slightly different, some dialogue changes, or that Poe arrived in this ship instead of that ship. Like, there's very minor things that change it, so it's kind of down to your own choice whether or not you'd like to go The Force Awakens version or Force Awakens novelization version, or if you'd like to go for the version in these comics. It doesn't really make a difference to the plot. I just thought I would highlight the very minor continuity errors, which I'm not going to delve into when we're here for all of them. I just thought I'd flag that up to you. But anyway, into the plot of issue 26. So it starts off with Poe, Finn and Rey talking aboard the Millennium Falcon after the Battle of Crate, which is the planet we saw in The Last Jedi. It's in the last scene. It's the salt planet that's a lot of red and white colours. Very visually stunning, but it's after that battle. So Poe recounts how he survived Jakku. He goes all the way back to just before he goes off to Jakku, where Leia gave him the mission to try and get the map from Lor San Tekka, which showed where Luke Skywalker is. So it shows some of the events of The Force Awakens, and then it cuts to when the TIE was crashing. That is in the first sort of third of the movie, when Poe and Finn escape the Star Destroyer. So Poe and Finn are in the TIE fighter that's falling down to Jakku, and Poe ejected Finn from his seat, and then as Poe was trying to eject himself, his jacket made him get stuck, so he ends up quite flukily falling out of the TIE fighter just before it crashed and rolled down a sand dune. And that's why his jacket was left in the TIE fighter, but why he wasn't. He then passed out until night time and obviously woke up and Finn was gone and so was the TIE fighter and things, so he decided just to walk on forward. So he keeps walking and meets a local who is a Blarina. So a Blarina is quite a new species to Star Wars. They were first in The Force Awakens and they're in a couple of comics as well, but not really anywhere else. So they're from the planet Rena Major, hence Blarina, because Blarina means children of the Rin. They are pink-skinned creatures, they are humanoid, they're generally quite short, and they are snouted as well. And the one you see in The Force Awakens is in Maz Kanata's castle, and it is called Woolyvan. And Woolyvan is played by Warwick Davis, because obviously he's in almost every Star Wars film, and almost every character he plays in Star Wars, their names start with a W. Obviously it started off with Wicket W. Warwick, which is obviously one of Megan's favourite characters, and then there's Woolyvan, who I've just mentioned here, and then in Rogue One you get the little creature with the giant mouth, who is in the Battle of Jeddah and a few other places, and that is Weetif Siu B. Then you've also got in The Phantom Menace, he plays Weasel, who is the guy you see at the pod race where he doesn't have any prosthetics on, it's just him there, and that same character pops up in Solo: A Star Wars Story. He's with Enfys Nest's Cloud Rider gang at the end, and yeah, it's Warwick Davis without any prosthetics. He's the same character, so that guy Weasel from The Phantom Menace is also in Solo: A Star Wars Story, which is a fun bit of trivia. And then also in The Phantom Menace, he plays a character called Wald. Wald is a Rhodian child, one of the ones who's with Anakin when he's starting up as pod racer and things like that. So yeah, he's been in loads. I'm not going to list every single one that he's done, but the vast majority of characters he plays in live action shows, their names start with a W. So back to the story. This Blarina is someone who Rey knew briefly. She wasn't overly fond of him, but he wasn't like explicitly evil. But when Poe was talking with this Blarina, the Blarina agreed to give Poe some water and take him to a nearby city, and in exchange Poe owed him a favour. So after a bit of driving, Poe's then recounting some of his stories from the Resistance, and then some thugs attack the speeder. Poe takes control of the speeder and then outpilots the rest of the thugs chasing them, manages to fly this little land speeder into the air and things, and then it clogs up the transport following them with a bit of sand, and then it gets them to Nima Outpost, and that's basically his debt paid. That's the favour paid to this Blarina. So then he gets to Nima Outpost, and a lot of people are talking about this notorious girl, a stranger and a droid, and they've all left the planet and things. So Poe goes and borrows a ship to get back to the Resistance base. Now when he goes back to the Resistance base on Dakar, he does mention there was a minor detour he had to take, and that was actually seen in the show Star Wars Resistance in the episode The Core Problem. Now I have been quite critical of the Resistance. I don't think it's a very good animated show, especially not by the standards set by the Clone Wars and by Star Wars Rebels, but it's okay. Series 2 is definitely a lot better, but it's still not amazing, but a fun little reference there regardless. So when Poe gets to Dakar, he confesses his failure to Leia and hugely apologises, and then she says not to worry because BB-8 has just been spotted on Takodana. So she tells him to go with the Resistance to Mars's castle on Takodana, and as she says at the First Order, probably know now as well. And the reason that the Resistance found out is because you see it in The Force Awakens. It's one of C-3PO's operatives called GA97 who tells the Resistance about BB-8 being there. And 3PO, especially in this Poe Dameron comic series, has had operatives quite a lot. Everyone else calls them his spy network, but he doesn't want them to be called spies. He wants them to be called operatives, but it's still a little fun thing, and it does get mentioned in other Star Wars media too. But that's basically the long and the short of issue 26. So we move on to issue 27. So issue 27 starts off with Leia is in the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon that's being piloted by Chewie, and she's thinking about Han, and obviously this is after Han's died because it was after The Last Jedi. Then Nien Nunb enters the cockpit. Leia then decides to leave and obviously thanks Nien Nunb for his service, and then Nien Nunb and Chewbacca give each other a fist bump, which I found was very entertaining. Now, Nien Nunb is a character that was first introduced in Return of the Jedi. He is a Celestan. Megan is not overly a fan of him because he looks a little bit freaky, really big bug eyes, but also because his bottom jaw is very wet. It's basically covered in like saliva or liquid and things, and Megan really doesn't like that. You first actually see him canonically in the Princess Leia comics. Now, I tackled them all the way back on episode 14 of Star Wars Comics in Canon. It's a 5-part miniseries, and they are included in the Heroes for a New Hope collection, which has got the Lando story, the Chewie story, and the Princess Leia story. So Nien Nunb appears in issues 4 and 5 of that. He also appears in other Star Wars comics and also is in Battlefront and things, but he's not in like a huge amount of media. However, he is in the Rise of Skywalker, and this is something that I didn't actually realise until I was looking up information about this episode, that he actually dies in the Rise of Skywalker. I didn't realise that when Palpatine shoots up his super mega ultra lightning thing, not going to go into that, but when that happens, it hits the Tantive 4 and it actually gets destroyed, which is, the original Corellian cruiser we saw in A New Hope. So that ship gets destroyed. I had no idea that happened, and unfortunately Nien Nunb is aboard that and dies too. So very sad to find that out, but we move on. So Poe continues recalling Takodana to Rey. You get to see his flight path that he took. So in The Force Awakens, one of my favourite scenes is when Finn gets out and then the Resistance charge in, and then Poe's ship takes out loads of people. You get to see like a bird's eye view of the castle on Takodana, and you get to see the route that he took and the little loop he did. It's just quite a cool little thing. Rey mentions that it sounds like the Force is what makes Poe such a good pilot and things, and Poe says that he's seen people with the Force and he believes that he just doesn't really have it. And as he says that, Leia walks in and says that we all do, we all have the Force. It is life's music, it's the song we make, which is a really nice thought, but also I imagine that Charles Soule wrote this when he was in the planning stages of the High Republic, because one of the characters, Avar Kriss, the way she sees the Force is as a music, as people's song, so I think that's a subtle sort of nod there. Then in between the conversations, Poe meets a Porg that he nearly sits on, which is a fun little interaction there, because obviously he didn't go to Ahch-To and things, so him seeing these little creatures surprised him, and I absolutely love Porgs, they're one of my favourite things. And he mentions to Rey he wishes he could have saved Mars's castle. He almost got there in time to be able to do it. And Rey mentions that obviously she missed that because she got picked up by Kylo Ren and was being tortured aboard his ship. And then Poe is like, oh, I was tortured by Kylo Ren as well. We're torture buddies. And they kind of high five, and I think that's quite cute and quite funny. And then the conversation goes on to Starkiller Base in itself. So Poe says that he actually knew very little about Starkiller Base. In fact, none of them did. The only thing they knew was about the vague location of it, just because after it destroyed Hosnian Prime, you could vaguely see where it came from. So they needed to find out more information about Starkiller Base. So it does a flashback, and you've got Leia asking Snap, Cara Kun, and Jess Parva to get information on Starkiller Base. Poe wants to volunteer, but she has other things she wants Poe to do. So in this flashback, Jess is then explaining to Snap and Cara about this pod thing that she's created. It almost looks like a motorbike sidecar. That's kind of the shape and the size of it. It's all mechanical. There are no droids aboard. There's no weapons, no shield. There's not really much on there apart from a scanner, a mag field generator, and some life support. So if it gets scanned by the First Order, it would just look like a meteor due to no signals coming off of it. She confirms that it basically needs to be taken by an X-Wing, and then you need to use the gravity of the planet that Starkiller is to then skim Starkiller's atmosphere, scan the system, find out what it actually is and if there's any weakness to it, and then get collected at the end of its sort of trajectory by the X-Wing on the other side. So they are obviously quite concerned about this because it's a very risky thing to do, but they agree to do it. And Jess is like, cool, well, I could get in the pod. Who wants to fly the X-Wing? And then Snap and Kara decide that they want to be the ones to fly the X-Wing and get in the pod. You've got Snap Wexley in the pod and Kara Kun in the X-Wing. Snap Wexley, you actually do get to see him in The Rise of Skywalker. Unfortunately, he dies, which sucks because he was one of my favourite little side characters. But he appears quite a lot in the Aftermath trilogy. He's one of the central characters. They're written by Chuck Wendig. They take place just after Return of the Jedi. They're within about a year and a half of that. It details the Battle of Jakku in that as well, like from Jakku's perspective. It's really, really cool. They're really good books. I think they're quite underrated. And it made me really appreciate Snap Wexley. I mean, his real name is Temmin Wexley, but he has a little tick almost where he snaps his fingers quite a lot. But I won't get into that. Go read Aftermath. So Snap and Kara Kun, they are together. They are married at this point, I believe now. And so Snap goes in the pod, Kara's in the X-Wing, and then they go on their mission. So the artwork of this element specifically is really, really good. Being able to see Starkiller like in comic form with some ships nearby, you really get the scale of it. It's very, very cool. But Snap's pod gets launched and then he skims over the atmosphere of Starkiller, but it starts to overheat. The ship is going wrong, the glass starts to crack and things. He's kind of freaking out quite a lot and saying to Kara, look, I'm just going to have to transfer you this data. It's going to go straight to you. You're going to have to leave. It's going to tell the First Order about this, but I'm going to die. Fortunately, she manages to save him by flying her X-Wing next to it and closing her S-foils. S-foils are the wings that come off the X-Wing, and the S-foil positioning is depending on what kind of mode, in air quotes, the ship is. So if it looks like an X, it's in battle mode, which when they can shoot their lasers and things. But when they are closed, it's more hyperspace mode, speed mode, trying to be quick and things. That's just what all the S-foils are. It's just the wings splitting in half or not to be able to be in attack mode. So she closes her S-foils over the pod and it kind of pinces it, almost like tongs. And then she grabs him and then manages to fly away and go back to the resistance base. So they get back to the base, and then obviously they have the plans for Starkiller, which is how they got them in The Force Awakens. So that's once again a fun little plot hole fill, I suppose. But that ends issue number 27, so we move on to issue number 28. So issue 28 is narrated by two unknown people to begin with. I'll go into it once we get there, but I think it's just a little bit of fun. So they're mystery narrators. There's a blue box and an orange box showing when one of them is talking over the other one. They talk about the Battle of Starkiller Base and about the Resistance and things, how it all basically went down. They said that there's something special about Rey, and that Han Solo is a maniac, but he's the best maniac there is. While Leia's around, there's always going to be hope because she's incredible, and that Poe is a fully fledged hero and he's amazing. And it's basically just other people's perspectives and kind of narrating on Starkiller Base and that whole endeavour and how they managed to blow up Starkiller in itself and how difficult it was. It was 1,000,000 to 1 sort of thing. So before I show who it was that says these things, I just want to read out a bit of text from one of them because I just thought it was really cool. So I'm just going to read some of that out now. So this is right at the end after the whole events of Starkiller Base have just been recounted by the orange box. And this is the blue box talking. Thank you for telling me all of this. I know it can be hard to talk about, but war stories are important. These things can't just pass into the night. I sometimes think it's my destiny to see things, to be present, to witness the galaxy moving, evolving. It happens to me over and over again, but even so, I can't see everything, and so I like hearing the stories and recording them. Stories are... And then the person gets cut off by 3PO. Would you two stop blathering, or at least do it on a closed circuit so we don't all have to hear you? Such a depressing subject too, my goodness. I'm involved in a very important project, and you're making it incredibly difficult to concentrate. And it shows he is talking to R2-D2 and BB-8. So if you want to actually hear how BB-8 and R2-D2 talk when their language, the droid binary, is translated, then you can read the first 9 or so pages of Poe Dameron number 28, because yeah, it's a full-on conversation between them and it's really touching. And that bit of text that I read out, that is R2-D2 talking. So R2-D2 thinks that it's his destiny to witness big galactic events and record them, which is a really cool thing. When this comic was first released, I do vaguely remember hearing people talking about R2-D2 and BB-8 talking in some amount of media. I couldn't remember where it was or anything. So when I read this issue, I was like, oh, that's really cool. So it's just a really fun concept for an issue, even though the first 9 pages looks fun. I did get to page 7 or 8 and I was like, is this going anywhere? Because so far this is literally just retelling parts of the Starkiller incident in The Force Awakens, but knowing that BB-8 and R2 were reading out was really nice. I appreciated that. So that's only about halfway through the comic. Obviously, I skimmed over quite a lot because it's them just narrating. But 3PO then goes over and speaks to Rey, and he translated a bit of old Jedi text for her. I'm not going to read everything he says, but part of it is, Jedi choose the light for all it reveals, which is a really nice way of saying why Jedi choose the light side rather than the dark side. Then while that's going on, it shows that Finn aboard the Falcon is checking on Rose, who is currently asleep after that pretty intense crash on Crate from The Last Jedi. Poe goes up to him and talks to him, and he's hopeful that Rose is going to get out of this and the Resistance are going to win, everything like that. And Finn is like, how are you being so optimistic? How can you think this is all going to work out? You know, we've been kicked down over and over and over again. And Poe says, yeah, I know it may seem odd, but I choose to believe in hope. I choose to believe these things will work out. And after a bit of back and forth, he says that he just believes things will work out. And then Finn says to him, well, what happened after he fought Kylo Ren on Starkiller Base? Because the last thing he remembers is Kylo Ren slicing him and him passing out on the floor, and then he woke up in a bacta suit aboard a ship, which obviously is when he wakes up in The Last Jedi. So Poe fills him in, and it shows the last few panels of this comic are that Leia wants to evacuate Dakar after the First Order have been defeated and Starkiller Base has been destroyed, but the First Order know where the Resistance are. Poe says that he can distract the First Order to be able to give everyone else enough time to evacuate. He goes to his X-Wing, which has got an untested experimental booster on it, which has been installed by Jess Pava. Black Squadron say they want to go along with Poe and help him in whatever he's doing, which is the very first start of The Last Jedi when he, distracts Hux and stuff. And Leia tells Black Squadron that she has a specific mission for them because Poe has to do this fly solo. So Black Squadron go off into the galaxy and try to get some help. They try and recruit people to the Resistance. And amidst Poe telling Finn about this, he's like, well, we haven't heard from Black Squadron since all of that happened, since they left for the mission, so we don't actually know what's going on with them. We're hoping for the best, but we don't know. And then 3PO comes in and confirms that they actually have got a message from one of the members of Black Squadron, but it is not good news. And that is where Comic 28 ends. So we move on to issue number 29. So we're now over the halfway mark of these 6 final issues of the Poe Dameron comics. So it starts off with 3PO showing Poe this recording that he's got, and it is from Jess Pava. And it actually gets cut off towards the end of her transmission, so they don't fully know what happened, but it was recorded during the events of The Last Jedi and the Battle of Crate, showing what Black Squadron were doing. So it's got Jess narrating it, and I'm just going to obviously go through the broad strokes of the story. You've got Jess, Snap, Cara Kun, and then Suralinda flying X-Wings. Suralinda is the friend of Poe's that was introduced, I think, in Poe Dameron Annual Number 1, and then has been in a few issues of Poe Dameron since. Snap, Jess, and Cara are in X-Wings, and Sura is in an A-Wing. They head to this planet called Pastora. They speak to the King, who wants their help in exchange for him helping rally more systems to the Resistance. So Black Squadron need to help escort one of his ships just to fly over enemy territory and deliver something. He is quite vague about these details, which Black Squadron are a little bit suspicious about, but they go ahead with it anyway. So they're on this escort job, and then some other ships come nearby, and the colonel who is in charge of this escort, and he says to them, we need your help. Black Squadron are a little bit apprehensive here. They don't really want to engage and then kill people and shoot at them or anything like that, so they hang back a little bit. Then, after a bit more back and forth, they do decide to assist, and then they shoot out one of the enemy ships. The enemies then pretty quickly retreat because it's shown that the X-Wings have far better shielding and weapons than any of the other surrounding ships, and so all the enemies then retreat, and the King's Colonel then chases after these retreating enemies. Black Squadron don't want to just chase down people and basically kill them cold blood when they're retreating, so they return to the King, who's called Sirok. He confirms that they killed his political rival, and so when the First Order show up, he can ensure that his people survive rather than trying to fight them and resist the First Order. Black Squadron were like, but you said you would support us in fighting against the First Order. I thought that was part of the plan. And he said, no, I said I would help you, and I am going to help you. You can have some fuel, and I'm also going to give you some advice. Get away from Leia, get away from the Resistance. The First Order, their first big act was to destroy an entire star system. Who knows what else they're capable of? You can't resist them. Just allow them to come through and hope you survive. And he confirms that the First Order are going to win. So Snap and Black Squadron get in their ships after it's been fueled up and then fly away, leaving the planet. And that's where issue 29 ends. There's a lot of action scenes and flight parts and space battles, etc., but that's the broad strokes of it. So we go on to issue number 30. So Black Squadron then head to the planet Ikkruk, which is the next on their list of planets that Leia gave, which may potentially assist with helping the Resistance. So Ikkruk. It is actually shown in the 2020 run of Star Wars comics in issue number 7. It's in a flashback, which is also written by Charles Soule, and it's also mentioned in the book Resistance Reborn, which is set between The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker, and it's kind of showing how the Resistance went from people just on the Millennium Falcon to a slightly bigger group of people that you get to see at the start of the final film. So Ikkruk is the home of the Ikkrukkians. Now, the Ikkrukkians are a species that I think Charles Soule somewhat had a hand in creating because they've only shown up in his content really. And you may recognise the species because if you're a reader of the High Republic, there is a very popular High Republic character called Porter Engle. He is an Ikkrukkian. That's when I was first introduced to them. So Ikkrukkians either have orange or grey skin. They are humanoid, but they have head bulges and they can live past 300 years. So Black Squadron head for Ikkruk, but the morale of all of them is very low, especially after everything with Pastora, and they just aren't seen to be getting anywhere. So they receive this distress call from Ikkruk, so they decide to go and assist. 3PO then interrupts this storytelling part to tell Poe that they've now received yet another message from Black Squadron, and he'll start decoding it, and then it should be decoded by the time Poe finishes listening to the current message he's listening to. But Poe lets out a sigh of relief saying, well, at least I know that they didn't die at the end of this recording, but, get on that 3PO, I'll listen to it in a bit. So it shows that the First Order, back in this flashback, seeing what Black Squadron were doing, were attacking the planet Ikkruk and specifically attacking like a capital city called Grail City, which has a very large shield around it. Black Squadron head in and then respond to this distress signal. The Ikkruk leader who sent it out is someone called Grist, and has confirmed that the planet's defences were all disabled by some local First Order sympathisers. Then these sympathisers then killed the engineers who could actually get the system all up and running again, so all they've got left is the shield, and once the shield's gone, they have got no defences. Jess Parva confirms that she can almost definitely fix their defence system because it's on this specific type that she quotes that she knows about, so she has knowledge in that. Grist says that they can open up a small hole in the shield once Black Squadron get close enough, and then they can let them in. The nearby First Order has got a heavy cruiser which is bombarding this shield, and it launches a lot of TIE fighters against these group of X-Wings to try and, stop them interfering or intervening in any way. So Kara and Snap decide to keep all of these TIE fighters busy, and there are probably 50, maybe even 100, 150 there. There are absolutely loads of them. And they say, look, Jess, you just get down planet side. You're the one who can fix the defense system. You do that. Suralinda, you fly your A-Wing and try and create a path for her. Get rid of anyone who's going to try and attack her. So Sura flies with Jess towards the ship, fighting off some TIE fighters. But then Jess's ship does get hit by a TIE fighter's shot. She does manage to get into the shield as the shield opens up that little hole and then closes again, but Jess's ship crash lands because part of the wing got clipped off. When the ship does crash land, it is almost completely destroyed and Jess is a bit injured, but she seems to be okay. But that is where the transmission ends. Then, as soon as the transmission ends, 3PO has just finished decoding the other transmission they received, so gives that to Poe. Then in the new message, you see that Jess Parva has been hugely beaten up. She's got a black eye, she's got blood on her face and things, and she looks a bit worse for wear. She confirms that it's all gone wrong. She's stuck in a cave, you've got Suralinda collapsed on the floor with a smoking hole in her chest, and they don't know what to do. So that's where issue number 30 ends, which means we move on to the finale of the Poe Dameron comics, issue number 31, which is the 6th in this story arc and the final issue of the Poe Dameron comics. So on the Millennium Falcon, you've got Poe and Leia are arguing with each other about trying to save Black Squadron. Poe says he wants to go save them, obviously, and then Jess needs his help and etc. And Leia says, well, you can't take the Falcon because you can't risk everyone's life aboard this ship and risk the Falcon, which is a really, really handy ship to have at wartime because of all its defences and everything else, that we can't risk it. So eventually, Poe manages to convince her, but he can't take the Falcon or anything like that. He just has to take another ship they've got spare. She also promotes him back up to Commander because obviously at the start of The Last Jedi, Poe did the whole flyboy routine and then got demoted from a Commander to a Captain, so now he's back to a Commander. So it shows what is going on right now on Ikkruk. You've got Snap and Kara are struggling to keep up. They're running out of fuel, they've ran out of torpedoes, and they're still trying to fight off these horde of TIE fighters. In the cave that Jess was in when she sent the message to Poe, she's got Sura on the floor who's looking pretty unresponsive, but she injects Sura with something in her neck. It looks like a stim pack, which is in Star Wars Legends. It's also in the canon in Jedi Fallen Order, the game. It's the main healing mechanism you use for that, and it's in other sci-fi content too. I remember being in Fallout, I think is the first time I saw it. But Sura wakes up, and she's obviously injured, but she has survived. And Sura says that she feels hopeless about winning any of this, but Jess says that they still have to try. So these First Order sympathizers on ground level start to approach. It's got some Ikkrukkians, you can't see their faces, but they are wearing white hoods over their faces with eye holes cut out and a red First Order symbol put on their forehead. I wonder what the inspiration for that could be. But Jess notes that the forces of the First Order sympathizers coming towards them have somewhat split up, so the group that are coming towards them are probably less so than they were earlier. Back up to Kara and Snap, Kara's ship gets hit and a First Order cannon locks onto her from the First Order cruiser that's nearby, because Snap and Kara decided to fly closer to the cruiser because they couldn't survive against all these TIE fighters, and the TIE fighters would be slightly less aggressive if they're nearby a Star Destroyer, because obviously any missed shots will hit the Star Destroyer. So back to the cave, you've got Sura is hiding on a ceiling, like rock thing, as Jess somewhat goads the First Order sympathizers to come in. As they come in and are in position, Sura then spits acid into the faces of these First Order troopers, and it starts to just melt all of their faces. And while they're screaming and distracted by the acid melting them, Jess jumps out of her hiding hole and then shoots all of them with a blaster. Back in the firefight with Kara, who is about to die from this First Order cannon charging up to shoot her, the cannon then explodes. They don't know how that's happened, and then you hear a yahoo or a woohoo, the standard noise that happens quite a lot in Star Wars, and it shows that Poe is in his ship and he is the one who saved her. He flies through, he destroyed that cannon, and then he brings up the morale of Black Squadron saying, look, we can get through this, we need to do it. He then communicates to the First Order officer, and he confirms that Snoke has been killed, as well as the First Order's fleet has been destroyed, and he basically confirms some of the events of the Last Jedi movie. Poe then gets Snap and Kara to draw the TIE fighters away from the battle that they're in. So they fly basically upwards, and then a string of TIE fighters is then following them, and so Poe manages to come in and with some great shooting manages to shoot all of these TIE fighters, and the TIE fighters' wreckages then fall and hit the First Order cruiser, which start to heavily damage their shields. Then the Grail City reduce their shield down, so they no longer have a shield protecting them, but then their cannons are now online, and they fire upon the First Order ship. So the First Order have been defeated, their ships have been destroyed, the city have got all their defences back now because they had to obviously turn off the shield to shoot and things, and Jess, Sura and Black Squadron have survived. Poe and Black Squadron are then fully reunited, and they are thanked by Grist for their help, and everyone is quite happy. And just before I finish off this issue, I just want to read out what Poe's final words are of this series. So this is Poe talking to Snap at the end of all this battle, and he says, I've been thinking about all of this, thinking about the fight. I don't think it's about heroes. I used to. Got that idea burned right out of me. It's not about Jedi or the best pilots in the galaxy winning against impossible odds. It's not even about saving the galaxy. It's about saving your galaxy, the one within your reach. You choose right over wrong. When it's dark, you try to bring some light. You end your journey knowing you made things brighter. If everyone made that choice, well, I think everyone can. Maybe they just need to see how you do it. I think that's the fight. We've lost a lot. Almost everything. But we can still do what needs to be done. We can still win. In fact, in some ways, the resistance has just begun. And that is where the Poe Dameron series ends, and it's got some beautiful artwork there on that final panel where you get to see Rey and Finn and Chewie and even Nien Nunb and other characters there, Rose, etc. And it's just a really, really beautiful way to end the Poe Dameron series. So that is basically the end of that, but now I move on to the Annual Number 2, Poe Dameron Annual Number 2. So Annual Number 2, written by Jody Houser. It seems to be taking place before The Force Awakens as far as I can tell, and it is on the Resistance base on Dakar, and you've got 3PO who has actually formed a plan, more specifically a heist that Leia approves. She calls in Poe and explains the plan. What will happen is Poe will pose as a smuggler, and he will take this old box that's made of very valuable materials, and it's containing some special plans within it. Some believe there may even be plans for an Imperial superweapon of some sort, and so he needs to retrieve that. You've got a Kudon who's called Nien Nunb, who has got possession of this box at the moment. Now, a Kudon is a cat/lion-like horned humanoid being. They have a variety of skin colours, often being blue, and they are found on the moon of Kudo 3, as well as a few other places. However, they are very new to canon, and they've barely been in canon at all. I couldn't find them in Legends, but they were first in this issue, annual number 2. They were also in the Age of Republic Anakin issue, which I tackled on episode 39 of Star Wars Comics in Canon, and they also feature in the Life Day comic. Now, I tackled the Life Day comic in episode 83 of Star Wars Comics in Canon in the Christmas special for 2021. So they are slowly making their way through the canon, but yeah, they've just been in 3 individual comic issues, so they aren't that widespread yet. So while this plan is being explained to Poe, it shows that Han and Chewie are in this comic, which was a fun little surprise when I was reading it. So it shows that Han and Chewie, they're finishing off a job they're in, they're having like a little shootout and things, and they manage to steal a ship, and they fly off with the goods and complete that mission, and then they're like, that's good, because we really need to meet up with Nien Nunb, because we've got that meeting with her, let's hope we're not late. So back to Poe, it's Poe, Snap, Jess and Kara, and they are going to use some old ships, but they're not overly happy with the ships they have to use because obviously the Resistance barely have any resources at the moment, but they have to use some old ships as well because they're trying to pass as someone else. They're trying to look like they're not part of the Resistance, they're just some smugglers. So they get a couple of ships, and I'm just going to tell you what each of these ships are very briefly. So you've got Cara Kun flying a V-19 Torrent Starfighter. Now, you'd recognise these because they're in a lot of episodes of the Clone Wars. They are also mentioned in the Thrawn book, and that's also in the 4th issue of the Thrawn comic adaptation of that, but they're not seen anywhere else in the canon. They basically look like the letter M. I'd call them M-wings if they were anything, but that's the general sort of shape and size of them. Then you've got Poe in a Z-95 Headhunter. Now, those ships are also very heavily from the Clone Wars, and they are also seen in the Star Wars Visions episode, The Village Bride, which is quite fun, and then they're also mentioned in Before the Awakening, but once again, they're just in Clone Wars quite a lot. They are one of the main ships, but there's 2 main ships from the prequels / Clone Wars. One of them is basically the Arc 170, which is what Jessica Parva is flying. They're like the predecessors to the X-Wings. You see them in that first scene in Revenge of the Sith. That's what the clones are all flying when they're trying to defend Anakin and Obi-Wan in their Jedi Starfighters. The clone Z-95 Headhunter is quite similar to that, but instead of its wings being like sprawled in more of an X sort of shape, it looks more like a standard TIE fighter, almost like a T kind of shape. So it's just a line with another line, like a vertical line, the horizontal line. That's basically what it is. And yeah, you can only really see these in the Clone Wars. Then you've got Snap. Snap is flying an Eta 2 Actis Interceptor. So that is, the full name is Eta 2 Actis Class Light Interceptor, and they're basically the Jedi Starfighters. So that's the ship that you see Kenobi and Anakin flying in the start of Revenge of the Sith, as I just mentioned. The ship, you get to see it in the Clone Wars a bit. It's also mentioned in pieces of other Star Wars content. It's in a few of the Vader comics as well, actually. But yeah, it's just another Jedi Starfighter, and even Snap makes a comment saying, I can barely handle this thing, I'm no Jedi. So they're the 4 ships, a V-19 Torrent, an Arc 170, a Z-95 Headhunter, and an Eta 2 Actis class Interceptor. So basically a Jedi Starfighter, a clone Starfighters, and then 2 other Clone Wars era ships, often flown by clones. So really fun little nod there, and I went into lots of detail there. I could have gone into far more detail, but I'm not going to, because this is not the Star Wars Ships in Canon podcast, although I'm sure that would be a lot of fun. So we move forward onto the rest of the story for the Poe Dameron Annual Number 2. There's a little flashback, just for like a page, where it shows that Lulo Lampar is showing Poe how to fly and handle a ship a little bit better, and that's just a fun little nod there. Then it comes back to modern time, where you've got Black Squadron in their old ships flying towards this Nien Nunb's cruiser. it shows that she is making a deal with the First Order to give this mysterious box to them. But then she notes there's a problem, there's an inconsistency with it, because someone listed on the shipment sheet is someone she knows to be a fraud. So she yells out the word fraud, and then a shootout occurs, and it shows that it was actually Han and Chewie, not the First Order. They were posing to be the First Order, trying to get this box so they could sell it. So the cover's blown, a big shootout starts, and then Black Squadron approach the ship. They use ion cannons to disable the ship so all the power goes out and then the emergency power starts up, so there's lots of red lights and things. And then mechs fighters appear. So there's a few ships that they all look very cool, the ships themselves. I think they're all quite unique to this comic. And so Black Squadron engage while Poe goes into the cruiser himself. As he lands and kind of gets out of ship and walks out, Mech then aims a blaster at him, but BB-8 manages to go behind Mech and stun her, making her pass out. Meanwhile, Han gets to the crate, and then he opens it up and realises that this must be for the Resistance and that they are here. So he tells Chewie, look, we need to leave this thing here, but he says, come on, let's clear a path for the Resistance, but let's do it quietly for once. So Poe then gets to the box and he notes that there's no one around, which is quite peculiar, and then it shows outside that the Black Squadron have managed to defeat these ships from Mech, commenting saying that their ships look nice, but their pilots clearly weren't that good. So Black Squadron all go back to Dakar. Leia opens up the box and confirms that inside of it is the original datapad, which is the archive for the Great Library of Alderaan. And Poe says, well, I'm surprised that you were going to sell it. And she says, well, I'm going to copy the data on this, but the datapad itself, being from Alderaan and what it represents, is incredibly valuable. And Leia hopes that she'll be able to sell it to a collector, and then they'll be able to put it up in a museum for it to be preserved forever. And that's really where it all ends. So you had a nice little run-in with Han and Chewie where they didn't really interact with Poe directly, but it was a fun little kind of thing. It's, a little nod that didn't take anything away from including them in there, and it's always nice to see Han and Chewie, especially older Han. He had his grey hair and things, that era of Han. My favourite Han Solo is actually from the sequel trilogy, controversially enough. But yeah, that, my friends, is the end of the Poe Dameron run of series. So I'm now fully up to date with pretty much all canon Marvel Star Wars comics, aside from what has been out over the last couple months. So basically Crimson Reign and the first few issues of Han Solo and Chewbacca and the Obi-Wan Kenobi miniseries. Once that Obi-Wan Kenobi miniseries is over, which should be in the next month or two, because I think there's only 5 issues of that, I'll be tackling that. I'll be tackling the first arc of the Han Solo and Chewbacca comics once we finish that first arc. But in the meantime, I will be tackling some of the Crimson Reign crossovers, which is, Dr. Aphra, Darth Vader, Bounty Hunters, and the Star Wars runs, all from 2020. It's the sequel crossover to War of the Bounty Hunters, and I just finished the finale of Crimson Reign, reading it in my personal time, which obviously I'm months ahead of yourselves with that. And then there's going to be something called the Hollow Empire, which is going to be starting in October time. Also in October is when all the High Republic Phase 2 stuff kicks off, so I think that's probably going to be when the new set of comics run off, as well as there's going to be I think it's a Blade of Bardota or something, which is the Porter Engle miniseries from the High Republic. He's obviously an Ikkrukkian. He's one of the ones that I mentioned earlier when I was giving examples, so that's going to be a fun one to do as well. There's also like another Cavan Scott comic coming out. I think it's called Tales from the Rancor Pit by Dark Horse, because IDW Publishing, I don't think they're making any more Star Wars comics. I think it's now going to be Dark Horse, but I think they're going to be still all age comics, so it's basically going to be the same. So yeah, lots of things there, lots of things I just kind of rambled and shoved down your throat very quickly. But with this Poe Dameron series, it was fun, it was enjoyable. I wouldn't say it's a must read. Of all the Star Wars big series I've read that are more than like 10 issues, this is probably the least exciting one, I'd say, just because obviously it's a prequel. It was very much held by, it started before the sequel trilogy had finished, so there wasn't really a lot of places they could go, but I like getting more information about my boy Snap, as well as Poe Dameron as a cool character, and there were quite a few cool storylines and references in these comics. But if you're going to pick up any Star Wars comic, I would not say it should be Poe Dameron if it's going to be your first ones to delve into that world, but it's still a fun comic to read. So what have we got coming up and stuff? Well, I believe that next week I'm probably going to start on the Crimson Reign comics. So I did a few episodes ago, which feels like ages ago because I've released 2 book reviews since then and the Q&A special and stuff, but in episode 97 of Star Wars Comics and Canon, that was my Crimson Reign prelude episode. So that's where I tackled the issues that are set after War of the Bounty Hunters, just before Crimson Reign starts going again. So when I do the Crimson Reign comics, it is going to be like I did with War of the Bounty Hunters. It's going to be the 4 individual issues from Aphra, Vader, Bounty Hunters, and Star Wars, as well as the individual issue, which is named Crimson Reign, because there's 5 of them in a miniseries. So it'll be all of those kind of sewing nicely together. So I'll be doing that over the coming months. I'll probably do one a month. I might might do a little bit more than that. I mean, we've got about 3 months till October, just under. So I might try and get all of those done before October. And then by the time October starts, I should be fairly clear with comics and things. But I am also going to tackle the Return to Vader's Castle horror anthology comics. I've also got one of the IDW publishing collections, which is Clone Wars Battle Tales. So I will be tackling that as well. And obviously in a month or two, then the Obi-Wan Kenobi miniseries of comics should be done. And so should the first arc of the Han Solo and Chewbacca comics. So that's basically what's on the schedule for the time being. I will be doing a book review for the last piece of High Republic content from Phase 1 I need to tackle, which is Midnight Horizon, but I'm only a few chapters into that at the moment, and I've been busy reading comics and doing other stuff, so I will be doing that at some point soon. So that's generally what you can expect. Please follow me on social media at Genuine Chit-Chat. Please consider checking out my Patreon at patreon.com/genuinechitchat. For as little as £1 a month, you get access to lots of Afterthoughts episodes. There's over 100 of them, and I also do book reviews on there I don't release anywhere else. So I've done some on Legends books, including Darth Bane and Shatterpoint and Darth Plagueis, as well as some canon novels like A New Dawn, Dark Disciple, Last Shot, and a few other things as well. So lots of fun to be had over there if you want some additional content and if you want to support the show. But you can also support the show by sharing on social media, telling your friends about it, and reviewing the show on Good Pods or Apple Podcasts or anywhere like that. And make sure you go over to my YouTube channel and subscribe, and so you can get all of my Star Wars content on there, as well as all my Genuine Chit-Chat content. There's video versions of conversations there. Obviously, I did my 100th episode very recently. It's nearly 3 hours long, so you can watch the video version of that I did with Ben. That's on YouTube, or you can listen on this very feed if you so desire. But thank you so much for listening. As always, my friends, I appreciate each and every one of you listening all the way to the very end. And I'll talk to you next week with the Crimson Reign comics. And as always, may the Force be with you. The intro for Star Wars Comics and Canon is arranged by myself, Mike Burton, and the backing music was made by Eric Matias of soundimage.org.
You have just experienced host, creator, everything elser of Genuine Chit-Chat, and also the host and creator of Star Wars Comics and Canon, found on the Comics in Motion podcast, Mike Burton.